I am Vivian Ashford, and I know that when you look at my mother, it's hard to believe she is only 44 years old. The gray strands that cover her head and the wrinkled skin tell a story of at least 8 decades. But the truth is, like all the women in my family, my mother was marked from a young age by the ability to see what others cannot, and this gift comes at a terrible price. It's not something we choose. This supernatural inheritance is passed down from generation to generation, like a curse deeply rooted in our blood. I've seen its weight on my mother, and she saw it in her mother before her. The gift is a double-edged sword on one hand. It grants us a perception that goes beyond the limits of the physical world on the other. It steals something that ordinary people don't even notice they've lost, like sand slipping through their fingers. With every vision, with every touch of the unseen, part of our life slips away. My grandmother, just like my mother, tried to protect me from this fate. But how do you avoid the inevitable? She was only 35 when her life began to fade because of the frequent use of this gift. To others, it seemed as though she was just aging too quickly. But we knew the truth. The price of seeing beyond is steep, and it takes without mercy. The first time I saw spirits, it was like glimpses, shadows that only I could see, lingering at the edge of my sight like shapes in the fog. The cold that would invade the air, the weight in the atmosphere, I knew something was there, something that didn't belong to our world but was there nonetheless. I would hear my mother talking about presences and energies, about what it meant to have this connection to the other side, and I remember feeling torn between fascination and terror. It didn't take long for me to understand that this gift wasn't a blessing. When I turned 14, my mother decided it was time to tell me the full truth. She took me to an old mirror, one that had been in our family for generations, and told me to look at myself. "Look well at the face you have now, Vivian," she said, her voice faltering for a moment. "It's a face that will soon cease to be yours." She explained that every time I touched the supernatural, my life would be slowly ripped from me. Time, which seemed linear to others, was like quicksand to us. And there, in that reflection for the first time, I felt the weight of what it meant to live with the certainty that every contact with the supernatural brought me closer to old age, even though the world still saw me as a vibrant teenager. My mother is a painful example of this burden. Every line on her face is a mark of the past, an invisible scar from the spirits and entities she helped calm. I know that with every step I take into the world of the dead, I'm following the same path. I walk a fine line between what is visible and what is hidden, always aware that this is stealing my youth. This burden follows me daily. Even though I want to, I can't ignore it. There are nights when I try to rest and feel a presence by my bed, a shadow, a biting cold that no one else would feel. And it's in those moments that I understand the true cost of my lineage. I can't run from it. I can try to escape. I can even pretend the supernatural doesn't exist. But there will always be a price, and time is never on our side. At the same time, something in me, perhaps a loyalty to those who came before me, refuses to back down. My mother always said that if we were born with this gift, it was for a reason. Every spirit helped, every tormented soul that finds peace because of us. All of that makes the sacrifice worth it. Even if, in the end, the price is our own vitality. I continue living with the constant expectation that, at any moment, I may look in the mirror and see a face older than the one I saw yesterday. I'm still far from 40, but the lines around my eyes and the paleness that's taken over my skin show signs of a time that only my lineage knows. And it scares me. Not so much because of the aging itself, but because of what it represents, an invisible countdown. There are days when all I want is to be a normal detective, with routine cases and mundane challenges. But that desire is nothing more than an illusion. With every person I help, with every truth I reveal to a lost soul, I feel like I'm fulfilling a greater purpose, something beyond me and my own life. Maybe, in the end, this is the legacy of my family. Not the curse of premature aging, but the mission of being guides between worlds. And as long as I have strength, I will honor this mission, just like my mother and grandmother did before me. Even knowing that one day, my own youth will be completely taken from me. Since I became a detective in the Boston Police Department, I knew it was only a matter of time before a case would pull me into the territory I feared most, the world of the dead. In the first few years, I kept my distance, dealing with disappearances and investigations that, though intense, were tragically common: runaway children, adults vanishing without a trace, families torn apart by uncertainty. But everything changed with one particular case, when the thin line between the supernatural and the physical world was crossed in a way I could no longer ignore. It was a rainy afternoon when the call came. A 9-year-old boy named Michael had mysteriously disappeared. Neighbors reported hearing screams in the middle of the night and then absolute silence. Hours passed without any news, and the tension in the air was palpable. I was assigned to the case, and something in the initial report made me shudder, an instinctive, unsettling feeling, like a warning that only I could sense. When I arrived at the family's house, I was met by the parents' desolate gaze, their red, tear-filled eyes, and a suffocating desperation that was impossible to ignore. I began searching Michael's room for any physical clues. However, even amidst the objects and clothes scattered on the floor, I felt something beyond the usual mess of a child's room: a cold presence, a faceless shadow that seemed to watch every one of my movements. It was as if the room itself was trying to tell me something. That was when I realized I was dealing with something far beyond a simple investigation. The shadow I felt was more than just an intuition or a vague sensation. It was an entity moving around me, invisible, yet incredibly present. I took a deep breath and closed my eyes, trying to focus, trying to listen to what that other side was whispering. With every passing second, the presence grew stronger, pressing on me in a way that was almost unbearable. In the corner of the room, I spotted a small, dusty mirror, framed with what looked like aged material. Something told me the mirror held a direct connection to what I was searching for, a sort of portal between our world and the supernatural. My mother used to say that old mirrors, kept with great care or negligence, often became receptacles for past energies, especially if something traumatic had happened in their presence. I hesitated as I approached. I looked at my reflection and in a flash saw a face that wasn't mine. It was Michael, his eyes wide and his face pale, but before I could even react, the image vanished. I knew what this meant. Michael was trapped between two worlds, perhaps not entirely alive, but not dead either. And I had little time to bring him back. Without wasting time, I began searching the house for any clue as to where he might be, but the answers kept slipping away. That night, I returned to Michael's room alone. The presence I had felt earlier had intensified, and the air was freezing as if time itself had frozen. Amidst the dense fog of supernatural energy, I heard faint whispers, voices of children, disjointed phrases, but one word caught my attention: basement. I descended the stairs slowly, each step creaking beneath my feet, each sound amplified by the unsettling silence of the house. I opened the basement door, and a sharp chill ran through my body. I knew there was something down there. The presence was suffocating, but at the same time familiar. I had to go all the way. I descended to the last step, and when I stepped onto the cold cement floor, a shiver ran down my spine. In the corner of the basement, there was an old, worn-out doll missing one of its eyes, the source of the energy that had been hovering throughout the house. My hand trembled as I touched it, and suddenly a vision hit me like a punch: Michael, surrounded by shadows, trying to escape, but held back by an invisible force, a cold hand that was keeping him in a dark place that wasn't quite the world of the living, nor the dead. At that moment, I understood he was trapped in a limbo, held by an entity that used the doll as an anchor, a bridge between the two worlds. It was something I couldn't explain to Michael's parents, or even to my colleagues. I returned to the basement with a jar of salt and some sandalwood oil, tools my mother had taught me to use to dispel negative energies. I spread the salt around the doll and rubbed the oil along its body, while murmuring an old mantra my grandmother had taught me to release trapped souls. It was a process that left me exhausted, and time seemed to stretch on endlessly. The moment I finished the ritual, a cold wind swept through the basement and the doll seemed to look at me one last time before its energy disappeared. Then, a distant scream echoed, and the energy that had permeated the place dissipated. I climbed the stairs with my heart racing, eager to see if anything had changed. When I reached the room, I looked into the mirror once more. The reflection of Michael was gone. He was free. Shortly after, we received a call Michael had been found disoriented, but safe, near a park on the outskirts with no memory of where he had been. To others, he had simply appeared after getting lost. But I knew the truth. With every contact with the supernatural, I felt my own face aging a little more. And in that moment, the image of my aged mother returned to my mind, a silent warning of what awaited me. This case was a turning point. From that moment on, there was no doubt about the mission ahead of me and the price I would pay to fulfill each one of them. I was ready, or at least, I thought I was. After Michael's case, something within me changed. It was as if a door had been opened on that might never close. The presence of the supernatural became a constant around me, sometimes as a shadow in the corners of my apartment, other times as whispers of ancient voices in the silence of the early mornings. It was a persistent reminder that I wasn't alone, that something was always lurking, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. But I couldn't let my personal life become just that. I had friends, co-workers, and a mother I needed to visit more often, especially now that the marks of her own supernatural burden were becoming more evident. It was painful to see the glow of her youth quickly fading, but she always smiled at me as if to reassure me, as if saying it was all worth it. One evening, after a long day at the department, I went to visit her. The house was silent except for the slow ticking of the clock in the living room. I had intended to just share a simple dinner, a break from the routine. While we were sitting at the table, I noticed her staring out the window, her eyes fixed on an invisible point, her expression serious and distant. "Is something wrong, Mom?" I asked softly. She took a moment to respond. Her eyes wandered to me, and I could tell that her mind was struggling to pull each thought out with effort. After a long pause, she murmured, almost as if speaking to herself here, "There's something strange. A spirit. It's near." Her voice was weak and broken, as though each word was a small battle against the fatigue of time. She continued, despite the difficulty, to relay the warning that seemed urgent. "Something. Older," she whispered, her eyes wide as if the image of the presence frightened her. "It's dark. Vivian. Pay attention. Don't. Trust." Her voice then faded, as if the energy she'd used to speak had been drained in an instant. That frailty unsettled me deeply, but I remained steady. I climbed the stairs, following an intuition that led me to my old room. When I opened the door, I was enveloped by a dense, cold atmosphere. A light mist seemed to hang in the air, like an invisible curtain that only I could see. I closed the door behind me, and as I felt the supernatural presence, I began to recite the old mantra my grandmother had taught me, a prayer of protection to ward off any hostile spirits. I placed my hand on my chest and whispered with determination, "From the light that surrounds me and the blood that unites me, I echo the voice of the ancients who walked before me. May the darkness dissipate and the evil fade away. May the restless spirit listen and find peace. Under the sun and under the moon, I protect my body, my soul, and my home." As I finished, the mist seemed to dissipate, and the atmosphere in the room lightened. However, a faint shadow remained, almost like a silhouette. "Why are you here?" I asked, feeling the weight of the words from the mantra still echoing within me. The figure remained still, and then a weak voice, almost like a whisper, echoed through the room. "They want you, the ancients." My blood ran cold. The ancients were a legend among the few who knew the mysteries of the supernatural. They were said to be ancestral entities, spirits that existed before human civilization, beings with incomprehensible power who, unlike common spirits, had an agenda and intentions that no mortal could understand. Just hearing that name made me feel like I was sinking into deep waters, where something massive and untamable awaited in the shadows. "Why me?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Because you carry the burden," the figure replied, before disappearing like a cloud dispersing in the wind. I was frozen, my heart pounding erratically. Who were these ancients? And why, of all souls, was I the target of their attention? There were no clear answers, just the unsettling sense that this was only the beginning, that I was drawing closer to something much bigger than any case I'd ever faced. I descended the stairs and found my mother still in the living room, her face concerned but exhausted, as if already preparing to bid the night goodbye. I left her house that night with the weight of the spirit's words echoing in my mind, and the world around me seemed darker, as if an invisible threat was following me. I tried to focus on my routine, on solving the cases I was assigned, and on keeping my life as normal as possible. But I couldn't escape the fact that the supernatural presence was more intense and frequent, as if the veil between the worlds was slowly tearing. And no matter how hard I tried to push the sensations away, they dragged into my life like persistent shadows. It was one of those lonely nights, while walking the streets of Boston after another long shift, that I encountered something even more disturbing. I was passing through an almost deserted square when I felt a surge of energy, an intuition that made me stop in my tracks. From the corner of my eye, I saw a slender figure hiding between the shadows of the trees. I looked in its direction and, with my heart racing, I realized the figure was watching me back, its eyes glowing with a deep, intense red. The feeling was overwhelming, a presence that radiated power and contained fury. I approached cautiously, trying to understand what was happening, but as soon as I took a step in its direction, the figure dematerialized into the air, like a reflection disappearing in water. The image of that being, the red eyes that seemed to pierce my soul, left me with an uncomfortable certainty I was being watched, pursued. And in that moment, I realized my life was transforming into something beyond a job. It was a call, a summons to face forces that perhaps no one else could confront. And although fear lingered, subtle and constant, a part of me knew I couldn't run. There was a purpose in every sign, in every shadow I saw, and in every supernatural enigma that crossed my path. I returned home that night with the feeling that something had been set in motion, a dark game that now had a new player. The words of the spirit kept echoing, and for the first time, I felt that my destiny was tied to something far beyond the cases and deaths I investigated, something greater, older, and that would demand everything from me. In the days that followed, the world seemed to take on a denser texture, as if an invisible layer had settled over everything. The words of the spirit and the encounter with the red-eyed figure haunted me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something more was coming, something my lineage might be destined to face. I spent hours at the city library, diving into my grandmother's old documents, searching for answers about the mystery of the ancients. Every fragment of information only deepened the enigma. These were entities so powerful that even spirits feared their name, with origins that stretched beyond human comprehension. It was said that the ancients existed before the first fire was ever lit by mankind, patiently watching the world evolve, waiting for the right moment to emerge. As I researched, I began to notice that the apparitions around me had become more frequent. It was as if every glance exchanged with a shadow on the streets, every whisper I heard in the night was a new invitation to dive deeper into the abyss of the supernatural. I tried to maintain my routine, but it was clear that the world around me was transforming, and I was changing with it. One night I was called to investigate the disappearance of a young woman who, according to witnesses, had last been seen wandering the city in a trance-like state. Upon arriving at the spot where she was last seen, I felt a familiar chill, as though something dark was lurking nearby. I knelt and touched the ground where she had been, trying to sense any residual energy. That's when a vision came to me. I was in a dense forest, surrounded by towering trees that seemed to breathe around me. The ground was damp and cold, and a thick mist hovered like a shroud over the earth. In the center of a clearing, a figure watched me. She was a woman with deep, dark eyes, dressed in garments from an ancient time. She gazed at me as though waiting for me to ask a question. But before I could speak, she raised her hand and whispered, "Your fate was sealed generations ago, Vivian Ashford. You are the last guardian, and the ancients are waiting for you." The vision faded abruptly, and I found myself back at the spot of the disappearance, alone and panting. I knew that this wasn't just any message, it was a summons, a silent command from a distant and mystical past. I felt a weight on my chest, the pressure of a legacy that might be too much to bear alone. When I returned home, I decided it was time to talk to my mother. Perhaps, despite her deteriorating health and fragmented memory, she knew something she hadn't yet told me, something that could guide me in the face of this revelation. When I entered her room, I found her sitting in her rocking chair, her gaze distant but serene. I sat next to her, holding her cold, fragile hand. After a long silence, I gathered the courage to ask Mom, "Did you know they would come? That the ancients, that they would choose me?" She turned her gaze away, her eyes cloudy as though trying to grasp a distant memory. After some time, she murmured, so softly I could barely hear, "I always knew. They never left our lineage. You are the last. I tried to protect you, Vivian, but they always find you." The exhaustion in her voice was palpable, but with one last effort, she continued, "Don't trust them. Don't let them take everything from you." I held her hand tightly, feeling the tears well up. In that moment, I understood the depth of the sacrifice every woman in my lineage had made. I knew my mother, my grandmother, and all those before them had resisted until their final moments, trying to protect something greater than any of us. I embraced her, and we sat in silence, a silence full of meanings that didn't need to be spoken aloud. It was a pact between us, a silent promise that I would continue to fight, that I would honor the legacy of our family, even knowing that it might cost me my life. That night, as I left my mother's house, I felt that a new chapter had begun. It was clear that what I was facing was not just a supernatural case to be solved, but a mission that connected me to the destiny of all the women who had come before me. And as I walked through the dark streets of Boston, one certainty filled my mind: I would face the ancients, no matter the cost.